All right. Hello, everyone. We'll just get started in one moment while we wait for everyone to join through the waiting room. All right. I see folks trickling in here. All right. So I see that our numbers have stabilized around here. Welcome, everyone, to our Indigenous Studies Trent Talks High School Edition. We are excited to welcome you to our Trent Talk that is titled Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, which I am very interested in hearing more about today. My name is Davina, and I'm a third-year business administration student specializing into accounting at Trent University, Durham, and I will be your moderator for today. And of course, I am joined by our course expert, Mara Hilbert, and our Indigenous Enrollment Advisor, James Miller, to help with any questions related to applying to Trent. We will be starting with our 45-minute lecture from Professor Mara, and then we will end the talk with the question and answer period. So on the bottom of your screen, you will see an option to type your questions in the question and answer section along the way. So please feel free to contribute, and we will answer all of those at the end. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Mara to get started with her mini lecture.
Chimikohech, Davina. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for making this time to come and hear me talk about truth and reconciliation. This is something I do a lot as a teacher at Trent, as a professor who teaches many of the Indigenous content requirement courses. So what I'd first like to do is I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on Treaty 20. And I want to thank the Michi, Sagi, and Anishinaabe for taking care of this land and teaching me how to take care of the land and all of my relations here. And I hope that I honor their teachings with this talk today. So I'm going to share my screen. And I apologize for my TA, my dog. She might have something to say. So I teach at Trent. I teach some of the really large first year courses with talking about the foundations for reconciliation and what do we do with all of that. And so the first thing I want to talk about is truth. I want to talk about my truth. It's really important to know who's providing you with the information that you are going to base decisions on, that you are going to decide how you're going to handle a situation or walk in this world. So what I want you to first know is that I am not an Indigenous person. I'm Jewish from downtown Toronto, and I started my career as somebody who got involved in social justice movements and traveling to other countries to help people. And then I came to Trent and I did a PhD in Indigenous Studies at Trent University. So it's important to start with yourself. Who are you? Where were you born? What's your positionality? And by that, I mean, were you middle class? Are you middle class? Are you in public school right now? Are you in Catholic school? What treaty territory do you live on? Do you know? Do you know that history? Do you know about Indigenous communities nearby? Or what's happening amongst urban Indigenous groups in your territory, in your city? What have you done with your life that prepares you to make decisions about what you're going to do with your ability to participate in reconciliation? So truth-telling, it's something that's really important. It's something that we all need to do because we need to combat stereotypes and racism. That's really important. That's who we want to be as Canadians, to look at the challenges we have in our communities and to make more kinder choices that support everybody. And so when I talk about reconciliation, it really becomes at first a personal choice. What are you going to do with the knowledge I give you today? What are you doing with the knowledge your teachers are giving you in the classroom with respect to reconciliation, and how you're going to make choices to participate or not? So acknowledging the truth is important. And this is difficult in our country. We live in a great place. However, we live in a great place that has a dark history, a history that hasn't been completely told to us. And I grew up going to public school in downtown Toronto. I never learned about residential schools. I never thought about what treaty territory I was living on. It wasn't brought to my attention. That's not my fault, but now I know. And that's another thing that we like to talk about. I'm providing you with some information. I happen to be a professor. I happen to have written a few things. Go out there, find information from reliable sources to learn about Indigenous peoples in your territory and to learn about the true history of Canada and the relationship with Indigenous peoples. It's not a pretty one. It's rather uncomfortable. And it's something as a non-Indigenous person, I've had to journey with and deal with all kinds of feelings and emotions about the choices my family might have made. And then the choices that I continue to make as I find my way as an ally and a supporter with respect to Indigenous peoples and this process of reconciliation. So in Canada, we need to acknowledge what's happened here, which means we need to listen to Indigenous voices and to the stories of Indigenous peoples. We do need to talk about genocide, both cultural and actual. I shouldn't be shocking you at this point, given the news about mass graves that has been popping up since the summer at residential school sites. And I'm sorry to say that we've heard of those stories when I started studying Indigenous studies all those years ago from survivors. If people were listening, we'd know there were mass graves around. Nobody knew where. Nobody had the ability to find them. We knew they were there. So now, at this point in reconciliation, there is a will and there is support to go find these graves. So we need to talk about that. And we need to find our way forward from that. And again, it's not pretty. It's not pretty, but we need to talk about it. So I'm not really going to talk about residential schools. There's a lot of information out there, and that information will continually be presented to you, I'm sure, over the next couple of years in a more detailed way. What I also want to talk about is the forced assimilation that has happened in this country and the issue of control that was established over Indigenous peoples. And I also want to talk about the sketchy dealings and promises that have been broken by various Canadian governments. Deals that were made that created this country. Canada is a country created on treaties. It's a very different history than our American cousins in the South. So treaties are important. They were an agreement, but they were also a relationship, and they were meant to be an ongoing relationship. So when we talk about reconciliation in Canada, we need to really talk about the truth. And for me, the legacy of what that truth is. So for residential schools, we often talk about intergenerational trauma. So that's trauma that is passed down through the family. So we have 150 years of young people not being parented, not knowing how to parent, and all kinds of issues that remain in communities because of this intergenerational trauma that is still felt by children and grandchildren today. How are we supporting that? How are we helping these communities? And this is a really big question. Again, I don't want to talk about residential schools because that's what everybody wants me to talk about. I want to talk about the Indian Act because people don't think about the Indian Act. They don't understand how this was an enforced policy to control Indigenous peoples in this country. And the Indian Act is still alive and well today. The Indian Act established who was able to call themselves an Indigenous person in Canada. The Indian Act created this definition of Indian. It also created this idea of enfranchisement to try to get Indigenous peoples to leave their communities, to leave the reserves, and to become a Canadian citizen and thereby give up all their treaty rights and all of the advantages that are connected to status, which includes the ability to live in their community. So if the men were away hunting and the Indian agent came by to make the roll of who was a member of that community and they missed that list, they lost their ability to gain status. If you were married as a woman to a man who didn't make the list or who chose enfranchisement or who went to university and decided to get educated, they then lost their status, and so did their wives and their children. If they went to fight in the war, they perhaps would come back and find that they couldn't go and live on reserve again, the First World War. So the Indian Act was amended over and over again to control Indigenous peoples, to define who an Indigenous person could be, and to segregate Indigenous peoples from the rest of mainstream Canada, so that mainstream Canada started to understand them as the stereotypes that the government presented them as. But as well, the Indian Act attacked culture. So we all know residential schools attacked Indigenous cultures, and that's why we talk about cultural genocide. The lack of ability for young Indigenous students to speak their language, dress in their traditional clothing, to participate in anything that is connected to their culture. Well, the Indian Act, for those left on reserve, they took away the ability to practice culture as well. And many of those cultural pieces went underground. That knowledge went underground. So, for instance, they took away the right to gather and have ceremonies. They took away the right to wear regalia. A series of nonstop amendments to control Indigenous peoples and encourage them, push them towards this idea of enfranchisement. So, James, perhaps you want to add in something about enfranchisement? So this is your reality. This is your lived experience.
Miigwech Mara. So just briefly, Bonjour Kinagoya. Hello, everyone. Tukogeo Nene and Dishnakaz, Benesindo Dem, Omamo Nene Nishnabe and Da, Kichikawanging and Dunjaba, Minwano Gojuanang and Dida, and Trent University Indigenous Enrollment Advisor and Dunjino Ki. So what I said there in Anishinabemo, and I gave you my traditional name, so it means he who ties things up. I'm a member of the Ruffed Grouse clan. I'm Algonquin Anishinaabe. In our language, we say Omamo Nene. I originally come from Toronto, and I currently live in Peterborough, and I work for Trent University. So yeah, enfranchisement is a very complex thing. As Mara touched on, not only does it strip us of our identity officially as far as it pertains to the Canadian government and treaty negotiations, but it leaves us somewhat voiceless and in a void. So even though we're Indigenous people, if we're living off reserve and we don't have our Indigenous status or Indian status, as the government calls it, it really affects our ability to engage with our communities as far as it pertains to any decisions with nation building. So in present day, any land claims negotiations or things like that, you'll often need to have status in order to engage in that. So in my family, there were a couple of different things that happened with enfranchisement. So I had great uncles and great grandfathers who went and fought in World War I. And so as a result, certain branches of my family lost their status because my grandfathers decided to go and my great uncles decided to go and fight on behalf of the treaty obligations that we had with the government of Canada. Another occurrence that happened in my family, my granny is Cree. One of her grandfathers was white. So at that time, if a white person married an Indigenous woman, the Indigenous woman lost her status and the children lost their status. So the way it worked in my family, there was a British guy who married a Cree woman. They had a son who was half Cree. He was classified as white. He married a Cree woman. She lost her status. Their son, my great-grandfather, was 3/4 Cree, was classified as non-Indigenous. And so as a result, until 1985, my grandmother, who was born in 1904, didn't have her status. And so I'm sure Mara will explain how some of those things started to change as she gets along in her presentation. So I won't spoil what's coming ahead. But that's just a brief window into some of the many ways that Indigenous people can lose their status, and also how it's important to remember, if you come across an Indigenous person, we may not have status, but that does not determine our indigeneity. We are Indigenous regardless of whether the government of Canada decides we're Indigenous or not. And those identity questions, I'm sure Mara will expand upon as well. But miigwech for giving me a chance to speak to that.
Miigwech, James. So actually, I just wanted to touch on that. And I want them to come and hear more from us at Trent, because it's something that's missing from the conversation out there for us, right? So I really appreciate that James is here and can share his lived experience and his knowledge. It's really important to understand that this impacts Indigenous peoples right now. So things changed in 1985, and people can come back and go through government paperwork, which we all love, to regain status. That doesn't mean it's going to happen. That also doesn't mean that they automatically gain band membership in their traditional community. That's a process as well. So it's a very complicated process. And it's still a point that, how do we support reconciliation? We support Indigenous peoples, individuals, communities, and how they're finding the way to support Indigenous peoples to gain their status, to gain membership in community. That's their role. And my role as a non-Indigenous person is to support, is to be an ally, to not say how it should be done, to not say how things should be fixed. Clearly, there's been changes, but we're still waiting for those to help everyone find their way and work on to being able to support all Indigenous peoples in their ability to identify how they want to identify. So I also want to talk a bit about treaties. Again, most places have land acknowledgements to acknowledge whose traditional territory you're on and the treaty that you're on, and that's really important. They're not all the same. There are many that have similarities, but they're not all the same. They've built our country and they continue to build our country. Most of BC is not covered in treaties. They are now engaging, I think there's 26, somewhere around 26 modern treaty negotiations going on at this point. So treaties are important. They're important to understand. It's also important to understand they represent a clash of worldviews. And it's also important to understand that treaty negotiations went on for days, sometimes months, with interpreters. And that the people that actually wrote down the treaties were the European powers. The treaties were held as oral tradition and in wampum by Indigenous communities. The documents that became law, became the treaties that you might see if you research them, are treaties and terminology written in the legal language of the European power. And for us, it's been mostly Britain. So what I want you to know is that a lot of those treaties leave out a whole lot of what was agreed to in those negotiations that took months. That our governments at the time left things out on purpose. And in fact, if you are from the city of Toronto and you look at the Toronto Purchase, I can show you how sketchy it is because it doesn't have any signatures that are original from Indigenous peoples. They're all cut and paste on from other documents. So when we talk about reconciliation and treaty agreements that the governments still do not honor, and the land that was promised that was slowly chipped away from, the understanding for Indigenous peoples that it wasn't forever, the understanding that it was the depth of the plow, it wasn't all the minerals and the coals that they have now taken out of the ground and changed the landscape and the ecology forever. So reconciliation, the truth, it's very complex, and I clearly cannot give you all that information in this short talk. What I can give you is, where do you look? If you want to be an ally and a supporter, you need to start looking. It's a personal responsibility of how you want to approach this big question and this big challenge that our country is facing. So, what I've been told by elders is the concept starts with being a good neighbor. Kindness. Kindness is really important. We don't know what the other person is dealing with, what's happening in their family, in their community, their challenges. So what I really want to encourage from this talk is about being kind, being supportive, not question after question after question of what's your right and who are you and how do you claim that. That's not for me as a non-Indigenous person to do. What it is for me is to be kind and to be supportive and to support the Indigenous communities and allies that I have in what they say needs to be done and how they would like to go about doing that. For me, it started with a personal choice to do something different. And that is what I suggest to you. It is a personal choice to gain that education, to stand in when somebody's making an inappropriate joke or sharing information that isn't correct. It's really important to know what the truth is. And as ugly as it may be, that is still the truth. We cannot move beyond that until we acknowledge that. So, reconciliation. When we start this, say in the Foundations of Reconciliation course that I teach, we have to talk about the truth and all those difficult things in detail. But we'd also like to talk about Indigenous resurgence, because as an ally, that's where you can go out and also help. What does Indigenous resurgence look like? It's Indigenous people leading the way in the struggle for reconciliation and for them to be accepted as they are, as they want to be accepted. So in supporting Indigenous people how they want to be supported, acknowledging and accepting how Indigenous people present themselves. Okay, so how do you do that? Expand your awareness. And these seem like simple things. And reconciliation is not a simple thing. And in reality, if you really want to get political about this, you're going to write to your local MPPs. You're going to go to a protest. You're going to stand there and you're going to support people. You're going to say, what can I do in this moment to support you? You can also do other things. You can support Indigenous peoples in their endeavors. You can attend an event. For instance, Toronto has an Indigenous Fashion Week. That's coming up this summer at Harbourfront. It's probably going to be online, but I don't know. We don't know. But you could go. You could go. And so, whoop, can you see my screen? Yeah, okay. So I just want to show you, because part of my job is about tearing apart stereotypes. And I want to show you that Indigenous peoples are urban, modern, and connected to their traditions. They have something to say that's important, and they have visions that I think we all can gain things from. So Toronto Fashion Week, Indigenous Toronto Fashion Week. So what else can you do? Imaginative Film Festival. That just happened. It happens every October. Go see a movie. What I also can tell you is, for those of us streaming, as I know many of you are, Netflix, Prime, there's many free movies on there, produced, written, directed, performed by Indigenous peoples. Watch them, find them. Sometimes there's humor, but there's also looking at the issues that are connected to their communities. For instance, missing and murdered Indigenous women. This is a huge issue. This is a huge issue. It's being worked on. It still needs support. Understand what the issues are. Watch one of those movies, get a sense. And I don't want to make this as simple as just watching a movie and understanding everything. It's not, but it's a place to start. It's a place to start. Your digital awareness, YouTube channels. There's a comedy group, the 1491s, a play on Columbus arrived in 1492 and everything changed. So they're the comedy troupe of 1491. Go to their YouTube channel, support them, watch them. Modern, non-stereotypical Indigenous presentation of themselves and playing on those stereotypes. So asking you to think about, what is your bias? What are you basing that on? Music. Some of you may have heard of a tribe called Red. They're very popular. Perhaps support them. Go to one of their concerts, buy one of their songs. I'll show you a bit. Okay, so combating stereotypes. Over 80% of Indigenous peoples would claim to be urban-based. That doesn't mean they're not connected to their community or go to their community. They live in cities. Indigenous peoples live in cities. They're modern peoples connected to their culture. And so connect to some of what they're presenting as themselves, as opposed to looking at some of the Westerns that are created or some of the presentations of Indigenous peoples that we might see in movies that weren't created by Indigenous peoples to represent themselves. It's really important. So expand your awareness. With COVID, of course, we haven't had any in-person powwows. We've started to have a few cultural events. Go. Spend a few dollars to go in, have an experience, support Indigenous vendors. Start to learn more. Sometimes it's just these little acts that will move you further and further towards more allyship and support. It's okay to do a few little things. It's okay to take those baby steps, as long as you're taking it with kindness and understanding that as a non-Indigenous person, you're not there to solve the problem. You're there to support Indigenous peoples trying to move the reconciliation process forward and what that means to individuals and to their communities. So look for community events. Ask Indigenous organizations if they need a volunteer. You have your time as a young person to, perhaps they're having an event and they need people to put up gates or fencing or to manage something. That's a way to help, and that's a way to be an ally and a supporter, and that's okay. So for me, my goal is to create awareness. My goal is to ask people to start thinking about how they think about reconciliation, because many people don't still, and what that means to them, and how can they be kind, and how can they help, and what level do you feel comfortable doing. And part of what I'm trying to do here today is make suggestions about how you can start that journey of perhaps being involved to some level that makes you comfortable, or perhaps slightly uncomfortable once you start to understand the true history of our country with respect to what has happened to Indigenous peoples and the oppression that they have overcome in many ways and started their resurgence and taking back their communities and operating and managing them in the ways they want to operate them. So I want to leave you with another video, because I think music videos hold a lot of value. This group is Norwegian artists, and this is an NGO that goes into communities to work with Indigenous youth to help them develop a song that they want to present. So sing it, write it, produce it, and then they put it up on YouTube. And they've done about 70 songs now. And the one I'm going to show you is from a community called Grassy Narrows, which is about 80 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. The thing about Grassy Narrows is that for 60 years, it's been fighting mercury poisoning. So 60 years ago, a pulp and paper mill dumped mercury into their water system, into their lakes that they relied on for water and fishing. I think the estimate now is around 90% of the population of Grassy Narrows has some kind of health condition created because of the mercury poisoning. Generational, we're talking about 60 years. It was only this July that finally the government has put aside, I think, $70 million to build a facility on reserve so people don't have to leave reserve for treatment, with beds that people with very severe mercury poisoning can stay in, and that other members of the community can come to for day help, whether that be meds or physiotherapy, because mercury poisoning can manifest in many different ways. So these young people have created this video, and I'm always impressed by the amount of hope that they have and the amount of kindness that comes through and caring for their home community. So
keep the worries that we've always had. It still lives inside. This is a place where we love the land. Let's work to show our pride. Keep us safe, keep us free, like it used to be. Don't wanna be tied down. We find love where we're from and beat against the drums. It's a beautiful sound.
From the ground up, we find the path home. Feel pulled by the sun, wish I can go. We learn from the past, now we can grow. We're promised a chance that the plans show. Go big, go far, there are no limits. I wanna see change, so my soul lives it. They cut down the trees, while we blow kisses. Defend our home while they dismiss us.
It feels like home to me. Gosh, going by. It feels like home to me. Sometimes it's hard to find the words to say home to me. Don't be afraid when you're falling in fast. There's something in the unknown. I held on to my culture, it's been calling me back. There is a story of hope. Winds of change, long ago. Hear a chance for a no. Our voices cried out for rain. Then it rained, brought us life, gave us faith, gave us sight. To see that we shall remain.
Let your spirit soar as far as you can. Try not to be reminded by the scars from the past. Rise from the ruins, keep protecting the land. Don't take it for granted, can't neglect what we have. Stand together as a nation, express what we feel. True conversation, address what is real. Connected to the land, we are one with each other. This is our home to discover.
It feels like home to me. Gosh, going by. It feels like home to me. Sometimes it's hard to find the words to say home to me. Sometimes it's hard to find the words to say home to me.
Gotta stay on point like the fastest arrow. Bring hope to the people of grassy narrows. One piece in the land can't go back to battles. It's fire in action, casting shadows. From old to the new, let us show you the truth. Light up the path, there's a glow in the youth. Boost you to the world, this is where we live. So let the journey begin.
It feels like home to me. Gosh, going by. It feels like home to me. It feels like home to me. Gosh, going by. It feels like home to me.
I'd like to say Chimigwech for listening, for taking the time to come and hear this type of a talk, which isn't always easy to hear. To know that if you do choose to come to Trent, we talk about this a lot, but we also talk about all the wonderful things in terms of the arts, and we have a lot of fun as well. So James, I thought I'd turn it over to you if you'd like to add something.
Miigwech Mara, I think you covered pretty well everything. I would just encourage you, if you are considering Trent, we have some really beautiful on-campus cultural activities, both at our Durham campus and up in Peterborough. So in Peterborough, we have an area we call Minidoag Akiing, which in the Anishinaabeg language, Anishinaabemowin, means the spirit lands. And so as you can see, my beautiful, super realistic background is a teepee. And that's actually a photo of the interior of the teepee that we have up at Trent. So at Trent University, our teepee is open for social fires for the whole university community from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. every Tuesday and Thursday. And then my department, First People's House of Learning, we run a firekeeper program. And so that's where Indigenous students can volunteer to become firekeepers and reconnect with culture and learn some traditional teachings. So they host those social fires every Tuesday and Thursday. We have an Elders and Traditional Peoples conference that happens every year. It's coming up in the springtime. I'll be sending out information at different school boards so people can log in and attend. We have a hybrid model, so you can attend virtually as well. We also have a virtual open house coming up at Trent University. I'm going to pop a link to that in the chat. It's coming up on November 20th from 10 to 3 p.m. And I would encourage you guys to reach out and attend that as well. It's free of charge. It's virtual, so you don't have to leave your house. And essentially, you can speak with professors like Mara, student support staff like myself, and Ryan, whose screen is off, but he is here as well from admissions. So you can connect with each of us, and we can kind of outline more details about each specific program that we have to offer at Trent. But going back to our Indigenous specific stuff on campus, as part of our traditional area, we also have a ceremonial grounds. We have a sweat lodge there, and we have a medicine garden. And we also have a second teepee that is at our School of Ed. And then down in Durham, we have a teepee as well with firekeeping programs at all three locations. And so that can be a really good way, if you do come to Trent, to connect with Indigenous culture, to learn more about Indigenous people, to kind of experience some of our culture as far as it pertains to firekeeping and stuff like that. We also do things like we make food over the fire sometimes, so you can come and get free snacks. So there's lots of interesting opportunities to interact. I suppose now, I guess we could open it up to questions, because if there are questions, that might be a good way to go, because I can ramble for a long time about different things on campus. But if there's any questions, I am an Indigenous enrollment advisor too, but if you have questions about a particular program as well, you can pop those in the chat, and I can always follow up with you or answer them here depending on timing.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Professor, and thank you, James, for that informative and insightful lecture and talk. And as James said, now we will open the floor up to any questions that you may have. And if there's no questions, that's completely fine. I would just like to thank everybody for joining us today. We hope to welcome you on campus someday soon. We offer campus tours Monday to Friday, and you can stay up to date with our tour offerings at trentu.ca/tours. As James said, we would also love to invite you to our virtual fall open house happening on November 20th, where you can meet our dean, current students like myself, admissions, scholarships, resident staff, and more. And just by joining this presentation today, you will be entered into a contest to win free first-year tuition. And one winner will be drawn for each of our two campuses. Every time you connect with Trent, like being in this presentation today, you will be entered into the draw. We are also giving away a Trent hoodie every day this fall. Just by attending this presentation, you will be entered into today's Trent hoodie draw. If any guidance counselors are presenting this to a class, or any teachers are presenting this to a class, you can please send an email to trenttalks@trentu.ca with all of the students' names and emails if they want to be entered into the draw. And if you have any questions past today, please feel free to reach out to Discover Trent at trentu.ca or Discover Trent Durham at trentu.ca. I thank you again for joining us today, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you. Bye, everyone.